Thanks so much for the invitation. As Lindsay said, I'm Andy Rumbach. I'm an associate professor of urban planning at Texas A&M University. Prior to this position, though, I was at the University of Colorado in Denver for 8 years. And so I'm familiar with many of you on the call today and have been working on issues related to disasters, climate change impacts, and historic preservation now for a number of years. And so I wanted, as an urban planning professor, I have it's a great aspect of my job that I get to be both a researcher and an engaged practitioner that's sort of valued within urban planning as an academic field. And so I want, in that spirit, I want to today sort of present some research and then also talk about, as a practitioner, some actions you can take around this broad topic that Lindsay introduced around ideas of disaster management. So I'm going to keep it fairly high level today, but again, I try to include as many resources and links and ideas to grab onto today so that those of you who do want to take more proactive steps towards disaster management feel like they have some resources to work with. For this audience, I don't need this slide at all, but I always include this slide when I'm speaking about historic preservation. I think it's probably not a surprise to say in this room that outside of the historic preservation world, not only is there oftentimes a lack of knowledge about historic preservation, and even in some spaces sort of a fierce contest going on about the importance of preservation relative to other goals. And so I often will be presenting this work to people like emergency managers and to others who I want to care more about historic preservation, and I want them to prioritize historic preservation within their disaster plans. Today, it's great because I get to do the opposite, where I get to talk to preservationists about the importance of disaster planning. And so, but I always start with this kind of basic understanding that we all have, that the historic resources we have are really important. And they're not just important because they're such amazing economic engines and they're such incredible resources for things like housing or commercial activities or anything else. They're also, they're what make places important and special, and they're what make people feel attached to places. And they're the things that make Colorado communities unique, and that is really worth saving. And I always say that historic resources, they're a non-renewable resource. Once they're gone, they're gone. And so disasters present a real threat to these resources that we value. And so planning for them makes all the sense in the world, even if we don't do nearly enough of it. And so what is disaster management? It's a broad term that we use to just describe all of the sort of collective steps that we take, not only to prepare for disasters, but also to respond to them when they do happen. And this includes the very long-term things we do that happen over years or decades, as well as the things that we do in that really small space around the time of the event that's happening. This sort of disaster management encompasses all of those, what we call the phases of the disaster management cycle. And historic preservation should have a role, or preservationists should have a role in each of those steps. There's important things that we need to do in each step of the disaster management cycle, and I'm going to talk a little bit about them today. One of the things that I think is the most important to know is that disaster management is a local activity. That sounds funny because we do have such strong top-down institutions within emergency management. We think of FEMA coming in, and we think of the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management coming in, or we think of first responders coming in, or we think a lot of that kind of response. But the reality, and any seasoned emergency manager will tell you this, disasters ultimately begin and end in communities. What happens, how at risk communities are, and their prospects after disasters for recovery all have to do mostly with within the sort of communities themselves, the specifics of the communities themselves. And so that's what makes programs like the CLG program so important for disaster management, is that disaster management can't be done at this very high level. It has to be done in every community individually, and it has to be done in a way that works for individual communities. And that's why as CLG folks, you have such a unique opportunity to help push forward this goal of better protecting historic resources. Also important to know that disasters are very short and very long term. I think the public often knows about, they think about the disasters in these very small time windows, usually when the media is covering them heavily. So if you were thinking about the Marshall Fire in December, a lot of folks are not thinking about it today, even though the communities are at the very beginning of their recovery. It's going to be years before Louisville and Superior and Boulder County recover from that disaster. The same is true for historic resources. There are short-term concerns, there are long-term concerns. And that all gets sort of folded under this umbrella of disaster management. And then finally, it's very complicated and it's very messy. And just like anything worth doing is, because it involves people, it involves money, it involves things people care about, it involves agendas that don't always agree with one another, but that's fine, right? There's a practice of this that we've learned over time, we've gotten better at it, and there's a lot of great steps that communities can take. The goal is never to completely reduce the impact of disasters to zero. We know that that's not, realistic. The goal, though, is to take the meaningful steps we can with the resources we have to reduce as much risk as possible, and then also to advocate for more resources to reduce as much risk as we can. And so again, the goal is really to have a plan and to take action, even if the problem seems at sometimes insurmountable.
An old photo of a busy Colorado street.
So the first part, I just want to talk about the disaster risk of Colorado, and this is the research side of the presentation. And so as part of my interest in historic preservation and from a disaster management perspective, a disaster planning perspective, one of the first questions that I asked is, okay, what is the scope of the risk in Colorado that we see? And this for me came out, I worked a lot in 2013 after the floods. I do my main area of work is around community disaster recovery, around housing issues, around issues of land use. But a few of the towns I was working with in the post 2013 lost historic resources. And I was at those meetings where there was these conversations about what was expected, what wasn't expected, what can we do to save these things. Some things were lost, lots of lessons learned, right? We shared a lot of lessons learned. And so from a disaster planning perspective, that to me brought up the obvious question. Well, what kind of risk do we have and how is it distributed around the state? How many of our historic resources are actually at risk of these kind of floods? And I started asking around and no one knew the answer to that. It hadn't been studied. And so, that's a good opportunity to study that question. And so, Colorado does have this long history of devastating events, often with very specific historic resource impacts, whether that's the Big Thompson flood, the 2013 floods, now the Marshall Fire, or any of the devastating fires we've had in the last few years, or other events that are less known, like many of the earthquake and landslide events that we've had in our past history. Colorado is a state that deals with a lot of natural hazards, and therefore there's risks all over to our historic properties.
A graph of yearly temperature changes.
And of course, we know with climate change that these events are becoming more frequent and more severe. And what that will look like exactly is still, I don't know if it's, the specifics are still being fleshed out, but we know pretty well this is what we think is going to happen. This is the most recent IPCC report shows us that we're very likely going to have about 4 more degrees of warming over the next 50 years. And that will be pretty extreme, or 3 more degrees of warming, and that'll be pretty extreme for Colorado. We're going to have much hotter summers, we're going to have much drier winters, and we don't know much about the rainfall patterns, but in general, we can probably expect longer wildfire seasons, more extreme flooding events, and that's part of our future. And so again, it's something we need to plan for.
Slide Colorado's statewide context.
So when we start asking this question of, okay, how many historic resources are actually at risk of these natural hazards that we're going to have? When we started asking around, the first thing we find out is that, well, it's uncertain exactly how many of these resources and what types are at risk. We do know in the state that there is this small but growing capacity to think about cultural and historic resources in terms of hazards. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later and specifically mention some organizations that I hope you all will keep in your Rolodex when the time comes. We also know that there is some emerging statewide planning documents that are acknowledging this problem at a very high level. So the State Hazard Mitigation Plan now talks specifically about cultural and historic preservation. We also have the Cultural and Historic Preservation Recovery Annex as part of that plan. The State Historic Preservation Plan now talks about climate change proactively, where it did not 5 or 10 years ago. And we also now have the Office of Resiliency as part of the Department of Local Affairs that thinks a lot about disasters and recovery as well. So there's this growing, if 10 or 15 years ago, if you'd asked around, I think the story would have been that there was this huge gulf between emergency management and historic preservation. Now I think there's this recognition that the two are important to one another. Maybe not as much action at the local level yet, but that's what these kind of webinars and these kind of actions will help us to accomplish. Everyone gets the issue, though, I think at this point, or a lot of people do, especially within the professional preservation world. So what we did is, and you do not need to look at this diagram, I just put it up here to show what we did is, okay, what turns out to be a simple question, how many historic resources do we have that are exposed to floods in the state? And then how at risk are they if they are exposed? Turns out to be a very, very complicated question. And so this is our actual overall research design. I'm going to give you a few findings, but I would also say if you're interested in the details here, there's 2 papers here that have all of the technical details within them. I'm happy to, they're linked up in this slideshow, and so we can share this slideshow after the event today. But the reason it's complicated is because, first of all, what constitutes a historic resource? How do we actually map that out? We have really good data on National Register properties. We have pretty good data on state register properties. We have pretty good data on National Register districts. Once you get below that, though, into local level stuff, we do not have very good data. And so that's one limitation of the study is, we set out to ask just historic resources and just floods, how do those 2 intersect? And so the first, on one side of the equation, this is limited to National Register, State Register, and National Register districts. We have not mapped out the local landmarks and other resources that you all may want to map out in your communities and put them up against your hazard risk data. On the other side of things, we need to know where floods are going to happen. And that turns out to also be an extremely complicated question, especially in a state like Colorado, which is big. It's got a lot of rural spaces. And so we don't necessarily have good data for all of the state. And I'm going to show you what that means specifically here in a second.
A map featuring flood data.
But we were able, so within the boundaries of the sort of limitations of the study, we were able to do a lot. And so we were able to say, okay, from all the sites that we could map in all the counties where we do have good flood data, we find that about 10% of all historic resources in the state are in a 100-year floodplain. So a place where we would expect a flood to happen, there's a 1% chance in any year that a flood would happen in that space. So 10% are in that 100-year floodplain. And those floodplains, like I said, with climate change likely will become, the floodplains will likely expand to a certain degree, or events will become more common. So we also looked at the so-called 500-year floodplain, and we found that an additional 6% of historic resources or National Register resources are in those areas. And so about 15% overall, 15 to 16% of our National Register properties are in floodplains. When we look at the just state register sites, again, very consistent numbers. Rather than 9.7, we have 8.14, but about 8% are in a 100-year floodplain. And I've left the bullet off here, but it should be an additional 6% also are in the 500. So again, 15% about of our resources are in floodplains. And then when you look at districts and we look at contributing properties within districts, we have 20% overall are in a floodplain. And these in some way touch a flood. I'll talk about some of the limitations of this analysis here a little bit later, but again, that's a pretty high number, right? So these are not small numbers. These are a fairly large percentage of our historic resources that we have under our management could be exposed to a flood event. And in the case of a 100-year flood event can often be quite severe, like we saw in 2013, for example.
A slide details municipal level analysis and features research questions, research design, and methods. So
that's just purely exposure, what stuff exists within floodplains. But that's not, from a disaster management perspective, that's not risk. That has to do with what could be experiencing a flood. The other side of it, okay, how good of a job are we doing planning for that then? Do we have plans in place to protect it? And where does that risk exist? How does that risk vary across the state? And so that was the next level of our analysis. And so when you start mapping this out, it looks, it's pretty interesting. So this, for example, this map and this chart are the number of historic resources. And as the square gets bigger, you have more resources within a given municipality. And then you also have population size. And so again, you might expect, oh, the Boulders and the Denvers would have a lot of the historic resources relative to population. And that's true, but you also have a lot of places around the state with relatively small populations, but relatively high numbers of historic resources. And that's something that, again, Colorado is very successful, has a very successful historic preservation program. And so we have a lot of properties around the state that have been put on the registers and are being protected in that way. And so again, you see it sort of all over the state, and you can obviously trace the sort of the different transportation pathways where you see the towns, especially eastern and western Colorado.
A map and a chart detailing populations in floodplains.
So then a second thing we looked at, okay, that's just the number of resources. Now, what about in terms of the number of historic resources that are in floodplains? What does that look like when we start to map it out? And again, we get a pretty similar story that we have, again, a couple of places with very high populations, but we have a whole bunch of relatively small communities that have a large number of historic resources in floodplains. And from a disaster management perspective, that's throwing up a red flag for us because again, one side of the equation is about what stuff might experience a disaster. The other side of the equation is what's our capacity to respond to it? What's our capacity to recover from that? What's our capacity to plan for that? And when you get out into smaller communities, more rural communities, you think of capacity going down, not going up. And so that's a major concern for us in terms of where we would think that the biggest issues might arise in terms of these resources getting damaged or destroyed during a disaster event.
A spreadsheet with case studies.
So we chose a whole bunch of these communities, 15 of them or 14 of them, that sort of represent the state overall, including looking at them by whether or not they have a certified local government or not. And then we went into these communities and we interviewed people and we actually looked at all their planning documents and all of their historic preservation ordinances and other things in order to get sort of a big picture understanding of were they prepared, how well prepared were they to have an event that affected their historic resources. And so these are the bottom line findings, and I'd be happy to dig into them later if anyone has any questions. But first of all, across the entire state, places recognize the value of their historic resources. They talk about them in positive terms in their plans, in their documents, in their charters, in their economic development plans. Overall, places recognize the value of historic resources, not just for their economic value, but also for their intangible value, their cultural and historic value to their communities, which is a great sign. People value these things, therefore they're already oriented towards wanting to protect them. However, very few communities, in fact, only a couple in the entire state, really proactively plan for mitigating risk to historic resources. And that's a huge, for us, a big issue, because that means that we have all the knowledge that is out there that exists. We understand that these things are valuable. We understand that they might be affected by hazards, but we're not doing too much at the local level to actually plan for that. And that's a big issue. That increases risk significantly. And so that's where we really want to focus a lot of our efforts, is on helping communities to be more proactive. There's a whole bunch of reasons why, and I'm sure many of us could off the top of our heads start talking about them, right? We already have too many responsibilities. We don't historically, we don't talk between preservation, emergency management, et cetera, et cetera. But again, if you buy into this idea that historic resources are at risk and that they're worth protecting from disasters, then we need to address this issue, because disasters start and end locally.
Bullet points about municipal level findings appear on a slide.
Historic preservation ordinances provide, they're pretty widely varying in terms of their protection, but we have some really great models in the state already on how to do really proactive protection. And I linked some of those up later, but that's a low-hanging fruit to look at, is some of these ordinances really recognize what would happen during disaster and make specific provisions for those events in order to make sure that we don't have unintended consequences.
A final bullet point appears on the slide.
And then finally, and this is what I alluded to earlier, places vary widely in terms of what we call in our field the adaptive capacity of these places. So once you know that there's risk, what can you actually do to manage it? And we saw that was very strongly correlated with the size of the community and its geographic location. So we have a lot of resources in rural places, relatively low capacity. We don't have a lot of specialists in those areas. Again, they're going to have different needs than the larger cities that have dedicated historic preservation organizations and nonprofits and other things that work together at that local scale. Not necessarily a bad thing here. Again, there's a lot of benefits to being a small town in terms of protecting historic resources, but again, it requires a different approach than we would with a larger place.
The word reactive with an arrow pointing to the word proactive.
Okay, so that's the research. We have a lot of properties at risk. 15%, I think, is a good bottom line number. And this is also only floods. So we didn't think about fire risk. We didn't think about landslide risk. We didn't think about avalanche risk, right? This is only floods. And so the number overall that have some hazard risk is very likely higher than that, especially when you start to factor fire into it. And so we know we're a state with properties at risk. Now the question is, how do we go from being reactive after a disaster happens to say, oh, wow, we should have done this, to being proactive, to using exactly what Lindsay said earlier about being proactive about protecting. And so I have 5 steps that I thought of for today's presentation. I was like, okay, if I had to just ask you to do 5 things, what would they be? And so again, these are pretty general, but I think they would all be, if everyone did all 5 of these steps, we would be in far better shape than we were today. So number 1 is this idea of knowing your risk in your community. Where are your historic resources? What individual hazards could they be exposed to? What kind of floods could you have? What kind of fires could you have? What kind of landslides could you have? And do those 2 things intermingle?
A bullet point appears on the slide.
What kind of compound hazards could they be exposed to? This is a little bit more advanced analysis, but if you're living in Manitou Springs right now, and you had the Waldo Canyon fire, the fire was one thing that really threatened your community, but now you have these floods year after year because the burn scar produces flash flooding, right? The fire to flood connection, you have to think about that as well. So beyond just like, do they exist in the same space? You also have to think, should we have had a big fire? Now, how much will our flood risk go up? A couple of years ago, I was working pretty closely with the city of Walsenburg, for example, which has a beautiful historic downtown, has a beautiful historic theater that they're renovating, but they had a major fire nearby that elevated their flood risk significantly for like a 10-year period. And so suddenly this whole historic downtown that was not in the floodplain before was in the floodplain. And so they had to take some pretty quick steps to try to mitigate that risk. And so those are the kind of multi-hazard events that we think about.
A 4th and final bullet point appears on the slide.
And then, of course, for your community, how will hazards change in the future? And how does that change risk? It's important not just to look at flood risk as it exists today, but also as it might exist in 20 years. And that's why we do plans, so we can look out into the future and think about, well, what are we going to need to do under different conditions in the future? And so this is an opportunity to think about historic preservation in our climate change planning context, for example. Okay, so how are you going to do that? Know your risk. Well, luckily, we have fantastic resources in the state of Colorado. Everyone here, I would guess 95, 98% of us have a local hazard mitigation plan. I doubt that most of us have read them, but if you go look for yours, you'll find it. And there's actually an enormous technical appendix that includes a lot of hazard data about your community. And so you already have that at hand, and you can use those resources to help you map out your risks. We also have some really neat online tools. We have the Colorado Hazard Mapping and Risk Portal that allows you to do flood mapping. It allows you to do some fire mapping. It allows you to pull in some specialized hazard maps like debris flows and other things, but we've put this all together. The state has, when I say we, the state has in the last, since 2013.
Bullet points outlining resources appear on the slide.
The Colorado Wildfire Risk Portal allows you to do this really intuitive, hands-on, in your browser mapping of wildfire risk, and you can put that again against your community's assets to see what might be at risk. Similarly, the Geological Survey has landslide data that you can also look at. So again, these things are all now at the tip of our fingers, right online. We can grab this data. We also have the Colorado Resiliency Office, which has a step-by-step guide on their website to doing these sort of very basic risk assessments. It's not specifically about historic resources, but if you follow the same steps you would for housing or for infrastructure or anything else, you can quickly map out some of your risks.
A slide about knowing vulnerabilities features a photo of a man with an old fire cart.
Okay, so that's the hazard side of things. Now, what about our vulnerability? How vulnerable are we? If we were to have one of those events that did touch on one of our historic properties, what is the likelihood that that historic resource would suffer harm? Whether it would be damaged or whether it would be destroyed, that's how we think about vulnerability, right? You could have 2 resources right next door to one another, one of which has taken a lot of steps to reduce its risk, the other which has not. And so they could have the exact same flood event and one would lose all of its historic resources within it, for example, its collections, the other one would not because they had a plan. So that's how we think about vulnerability. This is actually on the right-hand side. This is a picture from the Hinsdale County Museum evacuation from a few years ago, when you suddenly had this elevated risk from those avalanche led to flood, dam outburst, flood potential. And so they had to evacuate the entire museum. Again, this was the reactive side of things. Had the museum been proactive, they would have probably done things differently and had things differently arranged within the museum or ready to go. Luckily, they were able to evacuate things. Luckily, the flood did not happen, but it was a wake-up call again for the town that they could have lost a significant number of their local resources.
A bullet point appears reading site level analysis that asks, what if?
This get, the sort of broad view, okay, we have, 5 of our resources are in a floodplain. That gets you to a level where then you need to ask the more specific questions at the site level. Okay, what if we had a flood on this site? What would happen? Well, it turns out that the floodplain is actually on the road and it's not up to the building, therefore this site is safe. Or, oh, it turns out that the flood levels might be, they might affect this side of the property, therefore we might need to do some mitigation on that side. Or, there's all kinds of different what ifs that happen at that level. That's the next level of analysis we need to do, is actually talk to or think about individual properties within the context of individual events. And so this is often where I'm a planner, I think at this broad level, this is where we start to bring in preservation experts, architect, folks who know about the materials, who know about the conditions on the site, the owners, who, all of that in order to do what we call site-specific risk assessments, where we really get a dialed-in sense of, okay, how vulnerable really is this site? And if it is vulnerable, what can we do to reduce that vulnerability?
A bullet point appears reading, make sure to consider structures and contents.
And to Lindsay's point earlier, we need to think not just about structures, we also need to think about contents. And this is, again, from a disaster manager's perspective, when I hear about it's a lot of these things are very low hanging fruit, like not to have documents stored in the basement, right, in a place that it would experience floods. That's a really important thing. And yet you go to a lot of local museums, you go to a lot of local libraries and other places, and they do have archives stored in places where hazards happen. Or you have certain collections that you don't have marked as highest priority for evacuation, for example, and therefore the contents are not, during an emergency situation, it's hard to figure out what to do, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it's not just about the structure, it's also about the contents of those structures.
A final bullet point appears in hyperlinked font that reads many resources.
There's many resources for this. And so I link here to a website that has a bunch of the different resources. Again, you don't need to reinvent the wheel on this stuff. There's checklists, there's questions to ask, there's site-specific hazard assessment tools. All of this stuff has been developed. It's really a matter of just grabbing something and using it and doing the work on the ground in your own community.
A new slide with an image of the Manitou Springs Community Master Plan and Hazard Mitigation Plan.
Okay, step 3, or action number 3 that I would love to see every place take, is to review your plans and policies. This is a little biased. I'm a planner. I love plans. I think plans are important. But in reality, to me, plans are it's a statement about the values and priorities of a community. And whenever we have an action or a priority that's listed in a plan, it has a higher chance of being implemented, a higher chance of being funded, and especially can point out whenever plans are not pointing in the right direction, we can sort of align things to point in the right direction together. So take a look at your local comprehensive plan or master plan. Does it talk about historic resources at all? First of all, many places do not, but they should. And if it does it think at all about natural hazards? Again, I've reviewed a lot of the comprehensive plans in the state. There's not many that do. One that does, though, and does it really well, is the city of Manitou Springs. And so if you want a great example of a community master plan that thinks about hazards to its historic resources really carefully, look at the Manitou Springs example.
A bullet point reading comprehensive or master plan.
Look at your historic preservation plan, if you have one. Does it talk about hazards? Does it think about climate? If not, during the next update, you have a chance to weigh in on that and make these issues a priority.
A bullet point appears reading hazard mitigation plan.
Again, look at your hazard mitigation plan. 99.9% of the time, it's not going to talk about historic resources because that's not part of the basic formula that they use in order to get these things approved. They may have a list of the National Register properties, but there won't be anything beyond that. But in good ones, like the Manitou Springs example, they also have a mitigation plan that talks about resources in a real way. Again, a chance to weigh in on that process and potentially get some funding to help achieve some of these mitigation goals.
A bullet point appears reading emergency operations plan.
Emergency operations plan. Does your local emergency management office know about historic resources? And if they don't, is it a chance to educate them a little bit? Oh, this building over here, what would be your fire suppression tactics were a wildfire to come close to this building? oh, you can't do that, right? If you spray this building with that foam, it will destroy the integrity of the building. We need to come up with an alternative plan. Or, oh, if a flood, these kind of basic questions, these conversations we can have. Emergency managers are not, they don't know everything about everything, right? They need to oftentimes have issues put in front of them and then institutionalized in their plans in order to have them carried out. And so this is a great chance to, if you've never met with your emergency management folks, to sit down with them and talk about historic resources and disasters, especially when the skies are blue, right? We're not during an event, but before.
A bullet point appears reading Historic Preservation Ordinance.
And then lastly, like I said, look at your historic preservation ordinance. Some very common issues that I've seen with these is where they say the preservation ordinance will dictate a certain amount of, will not talk at all about, the ordinance itself will not talk about the specific actions that can be taken during an emergency event, for example, to shore up. Like, let's say, for example, that you have a fairly long procedure in place that you need to follow in order to make any site improvements. In an emergency event, you may have to take emergency actions in order to prevent the complete destruction of a site that may violate the order, right? Do you have some kind of emergency situation there where under if there's a general emergency declared, that the site owner can take some specific steps in order to protect the viability of the property? There's language already out there in ordinances to consider, and it's really a matter of just updating yours and adopting that language to give yourself those outs if you need them. Similarly, a lot of communities require that properties that are damaged beyond a certain percentage of their value have to be demolished in the event of a disaster. Don't include a phrase that exempts historic resources. And so again, it's better to have those exemptions in place to make sure that those kind of loopholes don't get either exploited or accidentally enforced, and there we lose properties accidentally based on that.
White header text on a photo of a dark blue sky. Action 4, assess your capacity.
Okay, action 4, assess your capacity. And this is, I put the blue sky in the background just to reinforce this message that this is all done best way before an event ever happens, not during the heat of the event itself or during the heavy politics of the recovery period. And the reason I say that is born out of a lot of experience. Like it or not, historic preservation does not end up falling high on the priority list for emergency managers based on sheltering and food and power. And then during the recovery, oftentimes preservation struggles to get recognition because the community is facing issues like home rebuilding and things like that, that they're hearing 99.9% of the public is upset about. Preservationists are often over here trying to make a case for preservation. Much better that the case has been made ahead of time and worked into our plans and policies so that it's not a policy choice that the local government has to make. Rather, it's already built into our policies and it's enforced no matter what. So this is really the kind of things we do anyway. Like, who do we have here? What knowledge do we have? What knowledge do we need that we don't have? And where can we get it? So if we're completely uncomfortable doing these risk analyses, we have no idea what we're doing, let's get someone here to help us. Let's call DOLA, let's call Historic or Preservation Inc. or whatever, like whatever organization is local to you has people who can help and maybe can add some additional resources that can help you do some of these activities.
A second bullet point appears.
Who do we have in this conversation and who do we need in this conversation that's not here right now? Again, a very important planning question and a very important question when it comes to disaster management. Oftentimes we'll have the emergency managers, but not the preservationists, or we'll have the preservationists, but not the emergency managers, or we need the property owner who really is in charge of that property that's on the register, or we need the nonprofit that manages it that may be out of state, whatever it is. We need to figure out who needs to be at the table for these conversations and strategically get them there at the right time to advocate for the policies that we want.
A third bullet point appears reading, are we connected locally?
Do we have good connections locally around these issues? Should a disaster happen, it's not going to be up to, individual property owners and individual stewards of these resources can't act alone. They have to come together and act together as a constituency. And so having those relationships in place before the event is hugely beneficial during the event and afterwards. If the preservationists have gotten together and talked about disaster management and said, okay, in the event of a disaster, we're all going to come together and we're going to, that is a huge step forward than trying to, what they say, exchange business cards during a disaster is the worst time to try to do that.
A fourth bullet point appears reading, are we connected vertically?
And then are we connected vertically outside of our community? Are we connected up to the state? All of you are, because we're on a call right now with the state and the SHPO office, but are you connected to DOLA? Are you connected to FEMA and DHSEM? Are these conversations a great chance to meet those folks, get your name in their Rolodex, get their name in yours, and to have some of these connections? It doesn't need to be some hugely intensive effort, but if one of your communities is going to organize a conversation locally about disaster management, and you invite the state to come participate and you invite FEMA, I bet you they'll be there, because they actually love those invitations, because it tells them that people are actually listening to what they do. And so, think about your vertical connections and who you would need to advocate for you should the worst happen.
A fifth bullet point appears reading, what financial resources do we have access to?
And then, of course, the most important question, which financial resources do we have access to, and which ones might we need access to? There are some specific funds out there, whether it's hazard mitigation grant dollars, whether it's certain state preservation dollars, or those are mostly for post-disaster sort of emergency work. But there are grants out there that deal specifically with historic preservation. And then there's grants that deal with hazards more generally, that if you had a strong preservation project could easily get funded, were there to be the support of the local government. So again, these are not unfunded mandates. There's actually a significant amount of money out there in the world right now for hazard mitigation, but making the preservation case is something that not a lot of communities have done yet. And I think that there's actually a lot of upside to trying to do that.
Black header text on a white background reading, Step 5, take action.
Okay, Step 5, like I alluded to, take action, right? This is all fine to say, and all the knowledge is out there, but actually doing it is what we really need to do, and we need to do it locally, because that's where disasters start and stop. And so we need to create these spaces to actually talk about these issues and to think about how we would problem solve locally based on our own environment, based on our own historic resources, based on our own relationships. We need to bring together the needed information for risk analysis and have that in front of people in a way that they can understand, and we can have that conversation based on that evidence, an evidence-based conversation about, here's the flood, what would we do, what resources do we need, what don't we have, et cetera.
A bullet point appears discussing communication.
Talk to stakeholders about these risks, and really, again, a conversation helps a lot in terms of getting the ball rolling and getting people's ideas flowing. And again, mitigation actions or disaster management actions, they vary so hugely between literally a property owner saying, oh, I should move my contents out of the basement, all the way to, oh, we should write a hazard mitigation grant application and get a grant to do infrastructure improvements to protect this part of downtown, and everything in between. But a lot of them are relatively low hanging, relatively low cost, and just getting folks talking about disasters and preservation together in the same conversation can spur a lot of great thinking and ideas. And so that's really what I would encourage you to do. Even if you don't have many resources, you don't have much capacity, have the conversation, do it over dinner or beer or whatever, and start those conversations and see where it goes.
A bullet point appears reading, get your plans talking to one another.
Again, if you're within this world professionally, get your plans talking to one another and make sure they're pointed in the right direction. They're pointed in the same direction.
A bullet point appears discussing prioritization of resilience and decision-making.
And then the last thing I'd say, and this is maybe the most important or the most meta of all action I would encourage you all to take, is don't think about disaster management as this other thing you have to do. Like, oh, okay, after I do my conversations about this and that and the other, I have to do this additional conversation. I don't have any time. I don't have any capacity. We need to think about disaster management as part of all of our conversations. We need to think about the likelihood of disasters during normal conversations. It's just as another element of those conversations. And so this doesn't need to be some separate big standalone thing. We should weave it into what we're doing already. Maybe it's having a special meeting of the Preservation Commission. Maybe it's when we're thinking about our criteria for designation of a local landmark, we have some kind of risk assessment as part of that, whatever it is. There's lots of steps that places have taken, but try to think about resilience as a lens that you work through rather than as a separate action that you have to take.
White text on a red background. If you do need to react, a screenshot of the task force website.
Okay, so that was all proactive. If you do need to be reactive and you've had a disaster and in your community, and whether you've planned for it or not, please make the first stop. Again, the SHPO will be also in this loop because they're part of this organization, the Colorado Cultural and Historic Resources Task Force. And so chrtaskforce.com. That is a group of preservationists, librarians, other kinds of collections experts, and then representatives from the state government, the federal government, the local governments, as well as the SHPO's office. Their job is to think about preservation and help communities to respond in the moment and make sure resources are getting aligned correctly. It's a volunteer network. And so please be sure to have them sign up for their list. You can basically ping them whenever something happens or whenever an event's getting close. And they're just a wonderful resource for connecting and helping things happen. And so make sure they're on your list of contacts.
Text, thank you. Texas A&M logo, runback@tamu.edu.